Chapter 1: The Interruption. Thursday mornings carried a rhythm David Connor trusted. Not because they were predictable, though they usually were, but because they didn't ask much of him. A clean suit, a steady cup of coffee, a commute that offered just enough time to let his mind settle into the day. It was a manageable pace, one that matched the way he approached most things. Deliberate, considered, free of unnecessary drama. That morning had followed the pattern perfectly. He had woken up before Susan, as usual when he stayed over, moving quietly through her apartment with the ease of familiarity that had taken 2 years to build. His suit hung neatly in her closet, one of several he gradually left behind. It wasn't a symbolic gesture so much as a practical one. They had both treated their relationship like something to be tested, not rushed into permanence. Parallel lives gradually overlapping. In the kitchen, Susan had eventually joined him, hair still loose, expression soft with sleep. "Don't forget we said we'd cook tonight," she had said, leaning against the counter with her mug. David had glanced over, considering. "You're the one who said we'd cook." I offered takeout as a perfectly acceptable alternative. She had smiled, the kind that suggested she'd already decided. "You just don't want to chop vegetables." "I don't want to pretend I enjoy chopping vegetables," he corrected. They had shared a quiet laugh, something easy and unforced. By the time he left, there had been nothing to suggest the day would carry anything unusual, which was why realizing he had forgotten his tablet felt almost amusing. David sat in his car for a brief second after noticing the empty passenger seat, then exhaled through a small smile. "Of course," he muttered to himself. It wasn't frustration exactly, more an acknowledgement that even well-managed mornings allowed for minor lapses. He locked the car again and headed back toward the building, adjusting his pace slightly, mentally recalculating how much time he'd lost. When he reached Susan's apartment door, he didn't hesitate. He opened it with the key she'd given him months ago, stepping inside with the casual familiarity of someone who belonged there. The sound of voices stopped him. Not immediately. At first, it was just background noise, a second presence that hadn't quite registered. But as he took another step, the distinct cadence of conversation pulled his attention into focus. Susan was talking, and someone else was answering. David paused, one hand still brushing the doorframe behind him, his expression shifting not into alarm, but into alert awareness. That wasn't normal. He moved forward, not stealthily, not aggressively, simply continuing the motion he had already begun. When he rounded the corner into the kitchen, the scene resolved itself all at once. Susan sat at the table, her posture relaxed, a coffee mug cradled in one hand. Across from her sat a man David had never seen before. They both looked up almost simultaneously. Susan smiled first. "Oh, hey," she said easily, as though he had just come back from grabbing something from the car. "Did you forget something?" David held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once. "My tablet," he said. She gestured lightly toward the bedroom. "I think I saw it on the nightstand." There was no hesitation in her tone, no awkwardness. The conversation she'd been having resumed an almost unnatural stillness, as if paused rather than interrupted. David didn't move right away. Instead, his attention shifted to the man sitting across from her. The stranger offered a small, measured smile, one that seemed carefully practiced to land somewhere between friendly and non-threatening. There was something in it David recognized instantly. Not confidence, presentation. David had seen it before, men who mistook composure for credibility. "And you are?" David asked, his voice even. Susan blinked, then laughed softly, pressing her fingertips briefly against her cheek, as if she'd just remembered something trivial. "Oh, right. I'm sorry," she said. "I forgot you haven't met Ryan yet. He moved in a few months ago." The explanation landed without weight. David let it settle. Then he looked again, at the two coffee mugs, at the angle of their chairs, at the ease in Susan's posture, at the man who watched him just a fraction too carefully. Understanding didn't come as a rush. It came as a quiet alignment of details. Ryan leaned forward slightly, extending his hand partway across the table. "Hey, it's nice to meet you," he said. "I'm new to town, and everyone around here's been really friendly." David glanced at the offered hand, then back at Ryan's face. He didn't take it. "I'm sure you'll find what you're looking for," David said calmly. "Unless you already have." There was a brief flicker of uncertainty in Ryan's expression, subtle but visible. David didn't wait for him to respond. He turned and walked toward the bedroom. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. His tablet rested on the nightstand, untouched. For a moment, the simplicity of that detail almost felt disconnected from what had just occurred in the other room. He picked it up, then paused. Then, without hesitation, he opened the closet. His overnight bag sat where he'd left it. Methodically, he gathered his things, shirts, toiletries, the small personal items that had quietly accumulated over time. Each movement was precise, efficient, absent of urgency but full of intention. He wasn't grabbing essentials. He was removing presence. When he finished, he gave the room a brief, final glance, then slung the bag over his shoulder and walked back out. Susan had resumed her seat, though her posture had shifted. There was confusion now, faint but growing. Ryan sat more rigidly, his earlier ease replaced by something closer to caution. When Susan noticed the bag, she frowned slightly. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm leaving," David said. The words were simple. They weren't raised. They carried no sharp edge, which made them harder to dismiss. She stood up, a small crease forming between her brows. "Are you still coming by for dinner?" she asked, as if adjusting the question might stabilize the situation. David looked at her. Really looked. Not with anger. Not with accusation. With assessment. "No," he said. "I'm leaving, Susan." The distinction hung there. It took her a second to register it fully. Her expression shifted, confusion giving way to something closer to alarm. She stepped toward him, closing part of the distance. "Wait, what is going on?" she asked. David exhaled slowly, not as a sigh, but as a calibration. "How long have you been having coffee with that cockroach?" he asked. The word landed sharply in the quiet room. Susan's eyes went wide. "What?" she said, startled. "What are you talking about?" David nodded slightly toward the table. "I'm talking about walking back into your apartment without warning and finding you sitting comfortably with a man you've clearly spent more than one morning talking to," he said. "A man I've never heard about." Ryan shifted visibly now, his composure cracking at the edges. Susan shook her head quickly. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said. "I didn't say you did," David replied. He stepped a little closer, not aggressively, but deliberately. "I said he has," he continued. "And you didn't stop it." Susan opened her mouth, then hesitated. David's voice remained calm. "Men with integrity don't try to insert themselves into the lives of women they know are in relationships," he said. "They don't sit across from them at breakfast like this is normal. They don't position themselves as the friendly, harmless presence waiting for an opportunity." He gestured lightly toward Ryan. "Cockroaches do that. They wait." Ryan looked like he wanted to speak, but didn't. Susan turned back to David, her expression now caught between defensiveness and doubt. "You're overreacting," she said, though the conviction wasn't fully there. David held her gaze for a second longer. Then he shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I'm reacting exactly as much as I need to." There was no anger left in his voice now, just certainty. He adjusted the strap on his bag. "I'm not breaking up," he added. "I'm not playing games. I'm giving you space to figure out whether you understand what this looks like." Susan's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. David nodded once. Then he turned and walked out. Chapter 2, The Silence After. David did not speed. That, more than anything, would have surprised anyone who knew him well enough to expect a reaction. The road ahead stretched into the familiar rhythm of his commute, steady lanes and predictable turns, and he followed it exactly the same as he had every other morning. If his grip on the steering wheel was firmer, if his thoughts refused to settle into their usual order, those were internal matters. They did not alter behavior. At the first red light, he exhaled slowly and leaned back slightly in his seat. "Assess," he muttered under his breath. It wasn't a command so much as a habit. When something didn't make sense, he didn't rush toward conclusions. He arranged details. Susan, 2 years. Reliable, comfortable, not impulsive. Ryan, unfamiliar, positioned too easily. The interaction, casual, unscripted, unquestioned. The words replayed not emotionally, but structurally. Susan's tone, her assumption that nothing required explanation. The seamlessness of it. That was the piece that didn't sit right. It wasn't what she had done. It was how little weight she had assigned to it. The light turned green. David pressed the accelerator and moved forward. By the time he reached the office parking garage, the initial sharp edge of the morning had already dulled into something more controlled. Not resolved, but contained. He parked, gathered his things, and stepped out into the echo of concrete and distant engines. Routine resumed. Inside the building, greetings came and went. "Morning, David." "Morning." His voice was neutral, his posture unchanged. If anyone noticed anything different, they didn't comment on it. At his desk, he powered on his computer, set down his tablet, and opened his calendar. Back-to-back meetings, a report due by mid-afternoon. One call he suspected would run long because it always did. Good. Structured work suited him. It gave his mind something to align with, and for a while it worked. He moved through his first meeting with his usual clarity, outlining points, responding to questions without hesitation. His supervisor, seated at the far end of the table, nodded at intervals, clearly satisfied. At one point, a colleague stumbled over a projection estimate. "That figure doesn't account for the adjustment from last quarter," David said calmly. "If you update that, the margin evens out." There were a few murmurs of agreement. The conversation realigned. Reliable. That was the word his supervisor used most often about him. Not brilliant. Not flashy. Reliable. And reliable meant showing up exactly as expected, regardless of what existed outside the room. Still, when the meeting ended and he returned to his desk, the silence pressed in a little harder. His phone sat where he had left it. There were 3 messages, all from Susan. "Susan. Hey, can you text me when you get to work?" "Susan. I think you misunderstood what was happening this morning. Susan, please don't do this without talking to me. David read them once, then again. Not for emotion, for content. There was no apology in the wording. No acknowledgement of what had been said. Only reaction to his leaving. He placed the phone face down. Not now. Across the city, Susan stared at her own phone with growing impatience. She had tried to keep her morning intact. She had gotten dressed, packed her bag, even finished her coffee, though it had long since gone lukewarm. Ryan had left shortly after David, offering an awkward, lingering, "I hope everything's okay," before retreating out the door. Susan hadn't answered him. Now, alone in her apartment, the quiet felt wrong. Not peaceful. Not comfortable. Interrupted. She paced once from the kitchen to the living room, then back again, her arms folded tightly across her chest. "This is ridiculous," she said aloud. The words sounded more confident than she felt. She replayed the moment in her head, the look on David's face, the calmness of it, which somehow made everything worse. If he had yelled, if he had been unreasonable in a visible way, she could have dismissed it more easily. But he hadn't. He had explained himself. That was the problem. Her phone remained silent. With a frustrated exhale, she grabbed her bag and headed out the door, locking it behind her with more force than necessary. The commute to her office was shorter, but it felt longer that morning, dragged out by thoughts she couldn't quite settle. He called Ryan a cockroach. Her lips pressed together at the memory. It was harsh, completely unnecessary. And yet, she stopped walking at a crosswalk, staring ahead without really seeing the traffic. He hadn't been talking about Ryan as a person. He had been talking about behavior. That realization didn't sit comfortably. When she reached her office, she moved through the routine mechanically, greeting coworkers, setting up at her desk, opening emails she barely skimmed. Her job didn't demand the same level of precision as David's. She could coast a little, especially in the mornings. Normally, that suited her just fine. Today, it left too much room for thinking. By the time she gave up pretending to focus, she had picked up her phone again. Still no response. "Fine," she muttered. She opened her messages and started typing. "Susan, you're making this into something it's not." She stared at the sentence, then added another. "Susan, he's just a neighbor. We have coffee sometimes. That's it." She hesitated, then frowned slightly. Why did that sound insufficient? She stared at the words for a long moment, then sent them anyway. Across town, David's phone buzzed softly against his desk. He didn't reach for it immediately. He finished the paragraph he was reviewing, adjusted a line in the document, then leaned back slightly before picking up the phone. 2 more messages. He read them once, then set the phone down again. Not because he didn't have a response, because he didn't need to give one yet. At lunch, he walked to a nearby cafe, ordered something simple, and took a seat by the window. Around him, conversations filled the space. Light, trivial, disconnected from anything that mattered to him. He took a bite of his sandwich, chewed slowly, then set it down. "Define expectation," he said quietly to himself. It wasn't a rhetorical question. What had he expected? Not perfection. Not isolation from the rest of the world. But awareness. Recognition that certain situations carried meaning, regardless of intent. He picked up his phone again, opened the message thread, and this time he typed, "David, you're right about one thing." He paused briefly, choosing the next line with care. "David, it's not about what happened. It's about what you think nothing means." He stared at the message for a second, then hit send. A moment later, his phone vibrated again. Immediate. He exhaled once before opening it. "Susan, that doesn't make any sense." A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. Of course it didn't. "Not yet." He typed again. "David, it will." He set the phone down after that and returned to his lunch. No escalation. No argument. Just a statement left where it could either grow or be ignored. Back in her office, Susan stared at his reply. "It will?" she repeated under her breath. Her fingers hovered over the screen, ready to respond, and then stopped. For the first time since the morning, she didn't type right away. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and let the frustration sit without trying to push it away. "What do you think nothing means?" The phrasing was frustratingly precise. He wasn't accusing her. He was pointing something out, something she didn't yet fully see. Across the city, David returned to his work. The afternoon unfolded with the same steady pace as the morning. Tasks completed, meetings concluded, conversations handled. Externally, nothing had changed. But beneath it, something had shifted. Not broken, not resolved. Shifted. A line had been drawn, not between them but around something they had never clearly defined. And now, whether they wanted to or not, they would have to decide where that line belonged. Chapter 3 Terms Without Language. By the time David left the office that evening, the day had settled into something deceptively normal. Work had been completed. Conversations had been handled. Nothing had slipped. Nothing had faltered. If anyone had evaluated him at 5 o'clock, they would have found no deviation from the standard they expected. Reliable. The word lingered in his mind again as he stepped into the parking garage. Reliable did not mean passive. It did not mean tolerant of anything presented to him. It meant consistent. And consistency, in his view, required boundaries, clear ones, even if they had never been spoken aloud. He unlocked his car, set his bag in the passenger seat, and paused before getting in. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and opened his messages. There were no new ones. That wasn't surprising. For a moment, he considered simply going home, letting another day pass, allowing distance to do its quiet work. It would be the simplest option, and simplicity usually appealed to him. But simplicity wasn't always clarity. He typed, "David, I'm free for a conversation, not an argument. Let me know if you are." He read the message once, ensured it said exactly what he meant, and sent it. Then he got into the car and started the engine. Across town, Susan had just returned to her apartment. The space looked the same as it always had, clean, organized, familiar. But it didn't feel the same. Something about the morning had disrupted the quiet assumption that everything in her life existed exactly where it was supposed to. Her bag landed on the couch with a soft thud. She kicked off her shoes and walked into the kitchen, glancing almost reflexively at the table. 2 chairs, 2 mugs now cleaned and set aside. Normal. Perfectly normal. Except it wasn't, apparently. Her phone buzzed. She crossed the room quickly, picking it up, her expression tightening slightly as she read David's message. She exhaled. "Not an argument," she repeated softly. Her first instinct was to respond defensively, to insist, again, that nothing had happened, that his reaction had been disproportionate. But the sentence stopped her just enough to reconsider. Not an argument, which meant he wasn't looking for escalation. He was looking for alignment, or recognition. She sank down onto the edge of the couch, phone still in hand, and typed, "Susan, I'm home. You can come over if you want." She hesitated for only a second before sending it. The response came within minutes. "David, be there in 20. She set the phone down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. 20 minutes. That was enough time for anticipation to build, but not enough time to rehearse anything meaningful. Which meant whatever conversation happened would have to come from instinct. That made her uneasy, not because she couldn't articulate herself, but because she was no longer sure what she was trying to defend. When the knock came, it was exactly on time. Of course it was. She opened the door to find David standing there, composed as ever, his posture relaxed but purposeful. He wasn't carrying a bag this time. He hadn't returned anything. That detail registered quietly. "Hey," she said. "Hey," he replied. A brief pause lingered between them before she stepped aside and let him in. He walked past her into the apartment, glancing around for only a fraction of a second before settling his attention back on her. They didn't sit immediately. For a moment, they simply stood there, the space between them filled with everything that had gone unsaid. Susan crossed her arms lightly, not defensively, but as if bracing herself. "So," she said, "not an argument." David gave a small nod. "Not productive," he said. She huffed a breath, a faint trace of humor slipping through her tension. "That sounds like something you'd say in a meeting." "It works there," he replied. She tilted her head slightly. "And here. We'll see." There was a quiet honesty in that which made her straighten a bit. "Okay," she said. "Then talk." David didn't move closer. He didn't sit. He simply looked at her, weighing his words. "I don't think you understand why this morning mattered," he said. Her lips pressed together. "I understand that you didn't like it," she replied. "That's not the same thing," he said calmly. She exhaled sharply. "Then explain it to me, because from my perspective, you walked in, saw me having coffee with someone, and decided that was enough to pack your things and walk out." "Correct," David said. Her brows lifted. "And you don't think that's extreme?" "No." The certainty in his tone landed with weight. Susan let out a short, incredulous laugh. "David, people are allowed to have conversations. I didn't do anything wrong." "I agree," he said. That stopped her. "You agree?" she repeated. "Yes," he said evenly. "You didn't cheat. You didn't lie. You didn't hide in a way that suggests guilt." "Then what is the problem?" she asked, her voice tightening despite herself. David took a small step to the side, resting one hand lightly against the back of a chair, grounding the conversation without closing the distance. "The problem," he said, "is that you don't recognize what the situation represents." She shook her head. "It represents me having coffee with my neighbor." "It represents access," David replied. She froze slightly. "Explain that," she said. David inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging the question. "You live alone," he said. "You're in a relationship. That's known information. A man moves into the building. He introduces himself, establishes familiarity, begins spending time with you in casual settings. Coffee in your apartment. Not in the hallway. Not in passing. In your space." Susan opened her mouth, but he raised a hand slightly, not to silence her, but to signal he wasn't finished. "That's not accidental," he continued. "That's progressive." Her jaw tightened. "You're making assumptions about him," she said. "No," David replied. "I'm identifying a pattern." She gave a short, frustrated laugh. "So you've decided he's some kind of strategist now?" "I've decided he's interested," David said plainly. The simplicity of that statement took the wind out of her rebuttal. "And even if he is," she said, her voice quieter now, "that doesn't mean I am. I didn't say it did." "Then why does it matter?" she pressed. David looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because you allowed the conditions for it to exist," he said. That struck harder than she expected. Her arms tightened across her chest again. "So now I'm responsible for what other people think?" "No," he said calmly. "You're responsible for what you encourage." The word hung there. Encourage. "I didn't encourage anything," she said, though the certainty had thinned. "You welcomed it," David said. "You normalized it. You made it easy." "That's not the same thing," she snapped. "It is to him." Silence settled between them. Susan looked away first, pacing a few steps before turning back to face him. "This is what I don't understand," she said. "You're acting like there are rules here that I never agreed to." David nodded once. "That's fair," he said. The response caught her off guard. "It is?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "We never defined this explicitly." She exhaled, some of the tension draining slightly, replaced by something more uncertain. "Then how was I supposed to know?" she asked. David considered that. "You weren't," he said. She blinked. "That's not helpful." "No," he agreed. "But it's accurate." A faint, reluctant smile tugged at her lips despite herself. "You're very calm about all of this," she said. "I'm not angry," he replied. "You called him a cockroach. I was describing behavior, not escalating conflict." She stared at him for a second, then shook her head with a quiet laugh. "That's a very specific distinction." "It matters," he said. She sighed, dropping her arms to her sides. "So what now?" she asked. David straightened slightly, his posture signaling a shift from explanation to decision. "Now we define things," he said. "Or we don't." Her brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means," he continued, "we decide whether we're building something intentional or just assuming it works because it hasn't failed yet." The words settled heavily. Susan hesitated. "That feels a lot bigger than one morning," she said. "It is," David replied. She held his gaze, searching for something. Emotion, uncertainty, anything that would make his position easier to argue against. But all she found was steadiness, and that made it harder. "You really would have just walked away from this?" she asked quietly. "I did walk away from it," he said. The distinction landed again, precise and unyielding. They stood there in the quiet again, the weight of the conversation fully present now. Not heated, not volatile, but undeniably serious. For the first time, Susan didn't try to counter him immediately. Instead, she asked the only question that felt honest. "What does meeting in the middle actually look like to you?" Chapter 4, Proximity Test. Recalibrated, the question lingered longer than either of them expected. "What does meeting in the middle actually look like to you?" David didn't answer immediately. Not because he didn't have one, but because he understood the weight of defining something that had previously existed without structure. Once spoken, expectations had a way of becoming real, and once real, they couldn't be ignored without consequence. Susan watched him carefully, arms now relaxed at her sides, though her posture remained alert. There was something different in her demeanor. Not defensive, not resigned. Curious in a way she hadn't been earlier. David finally stepped forward, closing the distance just enough to shift the conversation from abstract to personal. "It looks like awareness," he said. She tilted her head slightly. "That still sounds vague." "It's not," he replied. "We've just never had to say it out loud before." Susan gave a small exhale. "Okay, try me." David nodded once, accepting the invitation. "You don't have to justify every interaction you have with someone," he said. "I'm not asking for that. But there's a difference between something happening occasionally and something becoming part of your routine." Her gaze sharpened just slightly. "You mean Ryan," she said. "I mean patterns," David corrected. She crossed her arms again. Not tightly, but thoughtfully this time. "So if I had coffee with him once, that wouldn't have been a problem." "No. And twice. It depends on context." She gave a short, quiet laugh. "That's not helpful either." David's expression softened just a fraction. "It's not supposed to be easy to translate instinct into rules. If it were, we would have done it already." Susan regarded him for a moment, then walked past him toward the kitchen, leaning against the counter as she processed. "So what you're saying," she said slowly, "is that it's not about the event itself. It's about the build-up." "Yes. And the fact that I didn't think twice about it." "Yes," he said again. She frowned slightly, still working through it. "Okay," she continued. "Then what would you have wanted me to do differently?" David didn't hesitate this time. "Introduce him earlier," he said. "Mention it. Recognize that a new person spending time in your personal space isn't neutral. It's contextual." Susan considered that, then nodded faintly. That's fair, she admitted. The words came out quieter than her earlier arguments, stripped of their initial certainty. She pushed off the counter and walked back toward him, slower this time. But you have to understand something too, she added. I didn't think of it that way, not because I don't care, but because it didn't feel like it needed that level of attention. David studied her expression. I believe that, he said. She blinked, a little surprised. You do? Yes. That seemed to disarm her more than disagreement would have. Then why react like I did something serious? She asked. Because your interpretation and the reality of the situation aren't always synchronized, he replied. She let out a breath, half amused, half exasperated. That sounds like a polite way of saying I missed something obvious. It's a factual observation, he said. She narrowed her eyes just slightly. You're very good at those. I've had practice, he said. For a moment, the tension eased, replaced by a flicker of something lighter. Not quite humor, but close enough to suggest that they were finding their footing again. Susan turned and sat down at the table, gesturing for him to join her. This time he did. They sat across from each other, mirroring, in a way that neither of them acknowledged, the morning scene that had started all of this. But the dynamic was entirely different now. There was no ease in assumption, no casual oversight. Everything carried weight. So, she said, resting her hands flat against the table, what about you? David raised a brow slightly. What about me? You're putting a lot of structure around my behavior, she said. What does that look like from your side? He leaned back slightly in his chair, considering. Consistency, he said. That's a safe answer. It's an accurate one. She studied him for a second. Give me an example. David rested his forearms lightly on the table, grounding himself again in the conversation. If a new woman moved into my building, he said, and I started having regular one-on-one interactions with her in my apartment, I would expect that to raise a question. Susan's lips pressed together. Yeah, she admitted. It would. And if I didn't mention it, he continued, and you found out the way I found out this morning, how would you react? She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze shifted to the surface of the table, tracing an invisible line as she thought it through. Not defensively, but honestly. I'd probably, she began, then stopped. David didn't interrupt. She looked back up at him, a faint crease forming between her brows. I'd probably feel like I missed something, she said slowly. Like there was a gap in what I thought was going on and what actually was. David nodded once. That's exactly it. The realization settled between them, quiet but solid. Susan leaned back in her chair, exhaling as if something had finally clicked into place. Okay, she said. That makes more sense than how you explained it earlier. David allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile. This is the longer version. She glanced at him. You skipped this part this morning. I didn't think you were in a place to hear it, he said. She huffed a soft laugh. You're not wrong. A beat passed, then another. The conversation had shifted now, no longer circling around the incident itself, but expanding outward, into design, into intention. Susan tapped her fingers lightly against the table. So what happens with this situation? She asked. David followed her meaning without needing clarification. You decide what role he has in your life, he said. She tilted her head. That sounds deceptively simple. It should be simple, he replied. Unless it isn't. She frowned faintly. You're doing that thing again. What thing? Answering in a way that sounds like there's an obvious answer but not telling me what it is. David considered that, then nodded slightly. Because I'm not deciding it for you, he said. Susan held his gaze. And if I decide something you don't like? She asked. Then we address that, he said. How? She pressed. With the same standard we're using now, he replied. Clarity over assumption. She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. Okay. Silence settled again, but this time it was different. Not tense, not uncertain. Processing. Susan leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. For what it's worth, she said. I don't actually care about having coffee with him. David raised an eyebrow slightly. Then why does it exist? She shrugged lightly. It was easy, she admitted. He introduced himself, we talked a couple of times, and it just became a thing. I didn't think about it beyond that. David's expression didn't shift, but something in his posture relaxed. Then it shouldn't be difficult to reevaluate, he said. She gave a small nod. No, she agreed. It shouldn't. Another pause followed. Then she looked at him again, something softer in her expression now. You really meant it, didn't you? She asked. Meant what? That you weren't breaking up. David met her gaze evenly. Yes. And that you weren't testing me. Yes. She let out a quiet breath, leaning back in her chair. That's frustratingly reassuring, she said. He allowed a faint smile this time. I'll take that as a positive. You should, she said, a touch of humor returning to her voice. The weight of the morning hadn't disappeared. It hadn't been erased or dismissed, but it had been understood. and understanding, for both of them, mattered more than immediate comfort. Susan glanced around the apartment, then back at David. "So," she said, "no dinner tonight, obviously." "Correct." She tilted her head slightly. "Tomorrow?" she asked. David considered the question for a moment, long enough for it to feel intentional. "Tomorrow works," he said. She nodded once. "Good," she replied, and for the first time since Thursday morning had begun to unravel. Something in the space between them settled. Not back to what it had been, but into something more defined. Not effortless, but deliberate. And for both of them that was a step forward. Chapter 5, The Unspoken Ledger. Friday evening arrived without announcement. There was no dramatic shift, no moment that declared the situation resolved. Instead, the day unfolded much like the one before it. Structured, deliberate, quietly loaded with meaning that neither David nor Susan had fully sorted yet. David arrived at Susan's apartment 5 minutes early. Not out of urgency, but out of habit. He preferred not to rush the last few steps of anything that required attention. Conversations included. He stood outside her door for a second after knocking, listening to the faint sounds of movement inside. When she opened it, there was something different about her posture, subtle but noticeable. Less automatic, more aware. "Hey," she said, stepping aside. "Hey," he replied, moving inside. This time, neither of them commented on the familiarity of the space or the lack of it. The apartment felt like it belonged to Susan again, not in an exclusive sense, but in a defined one. That distinction, while unspoken, mattered. "Kitchen's that way," she said, a small hint of dry humor in her voice. "In case you forgot." David glanced at her. "I appreciate the reminder. Do you still have knives? Or is this a theoretical cooking situation?" She smirked slightly. "We're about to find out." The exchange was light, but it carried an undercurrent, something cautiously returning, but not yet fully relaxed. They moved into the kitchen together, gathering ingredients without the practiced ease they'd had before. There were small pauses now, moments where one of them would move slightly out of the other's way instead of anticipating it. Not awkward, just recalibrated. Susan set vegetables on the counter, picking up a knife and beginning to chop. David leaned against the counter across from her, watching for a moment. "You're holding that wrong," he said. She paused mid-slice and looked up at him. "I've been cooking longer than you've known me." "I'm not questioning your experience," he replied. "I'm questioning your efficiency." She raised a brow. That sounded insulting. "It wasn't meant to be," he said. "It was observational." She gave him a brief look, then adjusted her grip slightly anyway. "Better?" she asked. David nodded once. "Marginally." She let out a quiet laugh. "You really don't know how to say things halfway, do you?" "I don't see the advantage," he said. The small exchange softened something between them, just enough. As they settled into the rhythm of cooking, washing, chopping, stirring, the silence that followed was no longer tense. It wasn't entirely comfortable either, but it was functional. After a few minutes, Susan spoke again. "I told him not to come by anymore," she said, not looking at him. David didn't react immediately. "Okay," he said finally. She glanced at him then, searching for something. "That's all?" she asked. "What would you like me to say?" he replied. "I don't know," she admitted. "Something more than okay." David considered that, then straightened slightly. "Was it difficult?" he asked. She blinked. "No." "Then okay fits," he said. She frowned a little. "You're not going to ask how the conversation went? If you want to tell me, you will," he said. She set the knife down with a soft tap. "You're doing that thing again." "What thing?" "Acting like nothing needs to be acknowledged," she said. David tilted his head slightly. "I acknowledged it," he replied. "You made a decision. I recognized it." "That's very procedural," she said. "It's consistent," he countered. She leaned back against the counter, folding her arms loosely. "This is what I mean," she said. "You don't react the way I expect, and I don't know what to do with that." David studied her for a moment. "Do you need me to react differently?" he asked. She hesitated. "I don't know," she admitted. The honesty of it shifted the tone again. David stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, but enough to collapse some of the distance that had built over the past day. "You did what I said mattered," he said. "You evaluated the situation and adjusted it." "That sounds like I'm a system you optimized," she said lightly. He almost smiled. "You said you wanted clarity." She sighed softly. "I did. I just didn't realize clarity would feel like this." "Like what?" "Like I'm being measured," she said, searching for the word. David's expression sharpened slightly, not defensively, but attentively. "You're not being measured," he said. "You're being seen." She met his gaze, and for a second, neither of them spoke. "That's not always comfortable," she said quietly. "I didn't expect it to be," he replied. Silence settled again, heavier than before, but not in a way that pushed them apart. If anything, it forced them to remain present. Susan picked up the knife again, but didn't start chopping. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." She hesitated, then looked at him fully. Have you always been like this? She asked. Like what? This aware of everything, she said. This precise about how things fit together. David leaned back slightly, considering the question. For the most part, he said. Why? She asked. He let out a small breath, not a sigh, but something reflective. Because if you don't pay attention to how things work, you end up reacting to them after they fail, he said. She studied him, her expression softening. And you don't like that, she said. No, he replied. A small smile touched her lips. That's the understatement of the year. He didn't deny it. For a moment, she just watched him, something shifting behind her eyes. You know what I realized today? She said. What? I've been coasting, she admitted. The word hung there, quiet but significant. David didn't interrupt. I like us, she continued. I like how easy it is with you. But I think I started assuming that because it was easy, it didn't need attention. David nodded slowly. That happens, he said. She huffed a small laugh. Clearly. Another pause. Then she added, more softly, and I think you've been doing more of that attention than I realized. That was the first time she'd said it directly. Not defensively. Not as a counterpoint. As recognition. David didn't respond immediately. He didn't rush to accept it, didn't soften it, didn't redirect it. He let it sit. Finally, he spoke. I didn't keep track, he said. She raised an eyebrow. That's not an answer. It is, he replied. I wasn't keeping score. That's worse, she said, though there was no bite in it. Why? Because it means I didn't notice something I should have, she said. David tilted his head slightly. And now you do. She nodded once. Yeah. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was full of recalibration, of things being seen in a different light, not because something fundamentally changed, but because perspective had sharpened. Susan picked up the knife again and resumed chopping, more deliberately this time. So what does that mean for us? She asked. David considered that carefully. It means we stop assuming ease equals balance, he said. She glanced at him. And if it doesn't? Then we adjust it, he said. She let out a breath, then nodded. Okay. A faint smile returned to her lips. You know, she added, this is not how I pictured us cooking dinner together. How did you picture it? He asked. Less philosophical, she said. That was your first mistake, he replied. She laughed softly, the sound easing the last of the tension in the room. Yeah, she said. I'm starting to see that. They continued cooking after that, the movements gradually falling back into something smoother. Not quite the same as before, but not worse either. Just different, defined. And as they sat down to eat, there was no need to fill the space with constant conversation. They had said enough. What remained wasn't uncertainty. It was awareness. And for the first time since Thursday morning, that felt like something they could build on. Chapter 6. A mirror. Not a fight. Saturday arrived without ceremony, but with presence. Not the loud kind that demanded attention. The quieter kind that lingered in the margins, shaping tone without announcing it. Neither David nor Susan had formally planned to spend the day together. But by mid-morning, it became clear that absence would feel more deliberate than proximity. So, without discussion, David showed up. Susan opened the door this time already knowing it was him. There was no pause, no checking through the peephole. Just recognition. You're early, she said, though there was no accusation in it. You're predictable, he replied. She stepped aside with a faint smile. Come in. He entered with the same measured calm he always carried, but something about the air between them had shifted again. The tension of misunderstanding was gone, replaced by something more precise, awareness under observation. Not distant, but not entirely easy either. Coffee? She asked. Yes. She turned toward the kitchen, and he followed, though neither spoke immediately. The silence that settled between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was evaluative, as though both were subconsciously testing whether the adjustments made the day before would hold under casual conditions. Susan poured 2 cups, handing one to him without looking up. Do you ever just let things be simple? She asked. David accepted the cup, glancing at her. Yes, he said. She raised a brow. When they are, he replied. She let out a soft laugh. You see the problem with that answer, right? I see that you don't agree with it, he said. Because everything lately feels like a case study, she said, leaning against the counter. Us, specifically. David considered that. Only because we're paying attention now, he said. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. And before we weren't testing the structure, he said. We were relying on it. Susan frowned slightly, digesting that. So this is better? She asked. It's more accurate. She shook her head, amused. You always land on accuracy. It avoids confusion, or creates new kinds of it, she countered. He didn't immediately respond. Instead, he set his cup down on the counter and leaned back slightly, his posture signaling that he was shifting from passive observation into engagement. Say what you mean, he said. Susan met his gaze, then took a breath. Fine, she said. I feel like I'm being corrected all the time now. The statement landed cleanly. Not dramatic. Not exaggerated. Just direct. David didn't deflect it. Give me an example, he said. She gestured loosely between them. Yesterday, she said. The knife, the way I handled things with Ryan, even how we're talking now. It's like, I take a step and you evaluate it. David listened without interruption. And I get that you're trying to explain things, she continued. But it doesn't feel equal. It feels like you already know what the right answer is, and I'm catching up to it. Silence stretched for a moment after she finished. David didn't rush to respond. When he did, his tone was steady, unchanged but more deliberate. That's a fair observation, he said. She blinked, caught slightly off guard. Okay, she said slowly. I wasn't expecting that. It doesn't mean I agree with the conclusion, he added. There it was. Susan exhaled through her nose, a small smile flickering at the edge of her lips. Of course not. David leaned forward slightly, his focus narrowing. I'm not correcting you, he said. I'm responding to what's in front of me. It feels like correction, she replied. That's because you're measuring it as judgment, he said. She straightened a little. And how should I measure it? As alignment, he answered. She stared at him for a moment, then shook her head. See, that sounds good in theory, she said. But in practice, it just feels like you're ahead of the conversation and I'm trying to keep up. That wording lingered. David's expression didn't shift immediately, but something behind it sharpened. That's not intentional, he said. I know, she replied. That's the part that makes it frustrating. You're not trying to do it, but it's still happening. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The conversation had pivoted. Not toward disagreement about an event, but toward something deeper, how they processed, how they interacted, how they operated. David crossed his arms lightly, mirroring her posture from the night before without realizing it. Do you think I leave you behind? He asked. It wasn't defensive. It was precise. Susan hesitated before answering. Sometimes, she admitted. That was new. David absorbed it without visible reaction, but his silence carried more weight now. Not because you don't care, she added quickly, but because you move through things faster. You see connections I don't always see right away. Is that a problem? He asked. It is if I don't feel like I'm standing next to you, she said. The words settled heavily. David exhaled slowly, not to dismiss, but to process. That's not how I see it, he said. I didn't think it was, she replied. Another stretch of quiet followed. Then, something shifted. David uncrossed his arms and stepped closer, not to close distance physically, but to collapse the space between their perspectives. What do you need to feel like you're standing next to me? He asked. The question landed differently than anything he'd said so far. Not analytical, not corrective, open. Susan blinked, clearly not expecting it. She started, then stopped. For the first time, she didn't have an immediate answer. David didn't fill the silence. She looked down briefly, then back up. I think I need room to get there, she said. His brow furrowed slightly. Explain. I don't process things the way you do, she said. You see the whole picture almost immediately. I take time to connect it. And when you jump ahead, it makes me feel like I missed something. David nodded slowly. Okay, he said. That was it. Not defensive. Not dismissive. Just acknowledgement. She watched him closely. That's all you're going to say? For now, he replied. She studied his expression, trying to read whether that meant agreement or distance, but finding neither. Are you thinking? She asked. Yes. That's dangerous, she said lightly. It's necessary, he replied. Another quiet moment passed. Then David spoke again. I don't want to slow down the way I think, he said. That wouldn't be honest. Susan nodded faintly. I'm not asking you to. But I can change how I bring you into it, he continued. That caught her attention. How? She asked. By not assuming you're already there, he said. The simplicity of it was almost surprising. Susan let out a small breath, her shoulders easing just slightly. That would help, she admitted. He held her gaze. And you? He asked. What about me? What do you adjust? He said. She tilted her head, thinking. I stop assuming that because I don't see the problem immediately, it doesn't exist, she said. That was new too. David nodded once. That's reasonable. She gave him a small look. High praise. It's accurate, he said. A brief smile passed between them, real this time, unforced. They stood there, not quite in the same place they had been before, but not farther apart either. Aligned differently. This isn't a fight, is it? Susan said after a moment. David shook his head. No, he replied. It's a correction. She raised a brow. That word again. He allowed the faintest hint of a smile. A better one this time. She considered that, then nodded slowly. Yeah, she said. I think it is. And for the first time since Thursday morning, they both recognized it at the same moment. Not as conflict, not as strain, but as something far more useful. A mirror. And neither of them looked away. Chapter 7 Meeting in the middle. Sunday afternoon unfolded without urgency, but not without intention. For the first time in days, Neither David nor Susan felt like they were reacting to something. There was no immediate conflict to resolve, no conversation waiting to be dissected. What remained was quieter, more deliberate. What to do with what they had already uncovered. They met halfway, not metaphorically this time, but physically. A small cafe sat between their apartments, one neither of them frequented often enough to claim familiarity. Neutral ground. No ownership, no habits attached to it. Susan arrived first. She chose a table near the window, setting her phone down but not looking at it. Outside, people moved along the sidewalk in easy weekend rhythms. Couples, friends, individuals passing through each other's paths without consequence. She watched them absently, her thoughts circling something steadier than the last few days had allowed. Not confusion. Navigation. When David walked in, he spotted her immediately. Of course he did. He always did, eyes scanning just enough to register what mattered, not more. He approached without hesitation and sat down across from her. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she replied. No awkwardness, no visible tension, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. "You picked a place without committing to it," he said, glancing briefly around. She smiled faintly. Neutral territory. Intentional, he noted. She shrugged lightly. "I'm learning." A server stopped by, took their order, coffee for both, and left them alone again. For a moment, neither spoke. It wasn't empty. It was measured. Susan leaned forward slightly, resting her forearms on the table. "I've been thinking," she said. "That's usually productive," David replied. She gave him a look. "Don't ruin the moment." "I'll try." A small smile flickered across her face before settling. "I've been thinking about what you said," she continued. "About things feeling easy versus things actually being balanced." David nodded once, indicating he was listening. "And I realized something," she went on. "I didn't just miss the situation with Ryan. I missed a lot of smaller things before that." David didn't interrupt her. "You brought it up earlier," she said. "Not keeping score. Not tracking anything. And I think I took advantage of that without realizing it." The admission was calm, not heavy. Spoken like a conclusion she had already accepted privately before bringing it to him. David leaned back slightly, considering. "What do you mean by took advantage?" he asked. She tilted her head, choosing her words carefully. "Not intentionally," she said. "But I let you carry more of the structure, the consistency, the planning, and I just showed up and enjoyed it." There was no defensiveness in her tone, just recognition. David's gaze stayed on her, steady and attentive. "And now?" he asked. "Now I see that it only worked because you were doing that," she said. The server returned briefly with their coffee, placing the cups down between them. Neither spoke until she stepped away again. Susan wrapped her hands around her mug, grounding herself in the warmth. "I don't want to just benefit from that anymore," she said quietly. David didn't respond immediately. When he did, his tone was unchanged, but there was something just slightly softer beneath it. "That's a different perspective," he said. She nodded. "It is." A small pause followed. Then she added, "And I don't want you to feel like you have to manage everything for us to work." "I didn't feel that," David said. She raised a brow slightly. "You're going to tell me you weren't carrying more of it?" "I'm going to tell you I wasn't thinking about it that way," he replied. "Of course you weren't," she said, a faint smile returning. "That's kind of your whole thing." "My whole thing?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. "You don't dwell on imbalance. You correct it." He tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the observation. "That's not inaccurate," he said. She smiled into her coffee for a moment, then looked back up at him. "So here's what I'm asking," she said. "Not as a reaction to what happened, just going forward." David leaned forward slightly, attentive. "Okay." She took a breath. "If I miss something," she said, "I want you to tell me, but not like you already solved it without me." He watched her carefully. "Give me a way into it," she added. "Not just the answer." That was specific. David nodded slowly. "That's reasonable," he said. She studied him for a moment, then asked, "And what do you need?" The question landed differently now than it had before. Not defensive. Reciprocal. David considered it more carefully this time. "I need you to recognize patterns earlier," he said. "Not perfectly, but intentionally." She nodded. Meaning you don't wait for something to become obvious before you evaluate it," he said. She absorbed that, then let out a quiet breath. "Yeah," she said. "That sounds like work." "It is," he replied. She gave him a small look. "You don't make anything sound appealing, do you?" "I make it sound accurate," he said. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "Fair." Another pause settled between them, but this one felt lighter, balanced. Susan tapped her fingers against the side of her mug, thoughtful. "You know what's weird?" she said. "What?" "This doesn't feel like fixing something broken," she said. "It feels like adjusting something that was almost right." David nodded once. "That's because it was almost right," he said. She smiled slightly at that. "I like that answer better than most of yours. I'll keep it in rotation," he replied. She laughed. An actual laugh this time, easy and unguarded. That was new again. Not entirely new to their relationship, but newly returned after the tension of the past few days. David watched the shift without commenting on it. He didn't need to. It was evident. Susan leaned back in her chair, more relaxed now than she had been since Thursday morning. So what happens next? She asked. David took a sip of his coffee before answering. We keep going, he said. That's it. That's it, he replied. But we do it with more awareness than we had before. She nodded slowly. Yeah, she said. That seems fair. A quiet settled again, but it wasn't heavy or uncertain. It was grounded. Susan glanced out the window briefly, then back at him. You know, she said, I was actually looking forward to cooking this weekend without it turning into a philosophical discussion. David raised a brow slightly. You assumed that would happen? I hoped, she corrected. That was optimistic, he said. She smiled. I'm allowed to be optimistic. He nodded once. That's true. She picked up her coffee again, taking a slow sip. Dinner tonight? She asked casually. David considered it, not for long but long enough to show intention. Yeah, he said. Dinner works. She nodded, satisfied. Good. Another quiet pause followed, but nothing about it felt unfinished. There were no loose ends demanding attention, no unresolved tension waiting to surface. Just two people sitting across from each other, having done something neither of them had fully realized they needed to do. Meet, not halfway in compromise, but halfway in understanding. And this time, neither of them felt like they were catching up. Chapter 8 Forward, intentionally, Tuesday evening carried none of the weight that had defined the previous few days. That, more than anything, stood out to David. It wasn't lighter because nothing had happened. It was lighter because what had happened no longer felt unresolved. The air between him and Susan didn't carry tension waiting to surface. It carried clarity that had already settled. They stood outside his apartment this time. That alone marked a shift. Susan glanced at the building, then back at him, a faint smile tugging at her expression. You realize this might be the first time I've come here this week, she said. It is, David replied, unlocking the door. She stepped inside, and for a brief second it felt unfamiliar. Not because she hadn't been there countless times before, but because the context had changed. Every space they shared now carried intention behind it. She set her bag on the chair near the door, looking around as if reassessing something she'd previously taken for granted. You keep it exactly the same, she observed. I don't move things without a reason, David said. She nodded slowly, walking further into the apartment. That tracks. He placed his keys on the counter with the same precision as always, then turned back to her. Did you want to sit? Or are you doing a full inspection first? He asked. She glanced at him, amused. Give me a minute. I'm looking at it differently now. Differently how? She paused, then leaned lightly against the back of the couch. Like this would be mine too, she said. The words landed with quiet significance. Not dramatic, not heavy, just clear. David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped forward slightly, studying her expression. Not for doubt, but for intent. And, he asked. She met his gaze. And I'm trying to figure out what that actually means, she said. That answer was honest enough to hold weight. David moved past her into the kitchen, opening the fridge with a brief glance inside. Not because he needed anything, but because it gave him a moment to think without interrupting the flow of the conversation. When he closed it, he leaned back against the counter. It means adjustment, he said. She turned toward him. Elaborate. He crossed his arms loosely. Not defensive, just grounded. It means this isn't just a continuation of what we were already doing, he said. Living in the same place isn't an extension of convenience. It changes how everything functions. Susan nodded slightly, taking that in. So no trial run mindset, she said. No, he agreed. That part's over. She watched him carefully for a moment. That's a little intimidating, she admitted. It should be, he replied. She blinked, then laughed softly. You don't soften anything, do you? I don't see the value in pretending it's easier than it is, he said. She walked closer, stopping a few feet from him. And you think we're ready for that? She asked. David didn't answer immediately. He considered the question, not just the words, but the implication behind them. Then he spoke. I think we're aware enough for it, he said. That wasn't a simple yes, but it wasn't hesitation either. Susan tilted her head slightly. That's very on-brand for you. It's accurate, he replied. She smiled faintly, but her eyes stayed focused on him. Can I ask something more direct? She said. Yes. She folded her arms lightly, not withdrawn, but steady. If this had happened a week from now, if we'd already moved in together, would you have handled it differently? The question settled into the space between them, precise and unavoidable. David didn't look away. No, he said. She nodded once, absorbing that. And would that have meant something bigger? She asked. Yes, he said again. There was no pause, no qualification. Just truth. Susan exhaled slowly. Okay, she said. A moment passed. Then she stepped forward, closing the remaining distance between them. Not dramatically, just enough to shift their positions from separate to shared. I think that's why this had to happen now, she added. David raised a brow slightly. Explain. She gestured lightly between them. Because we weren't actually ready then, she said. We were just moving toward it because everything felt fine. David nodded once. That's consistent with what we've already established. She smiled slightly. You love saying things like that. I like when things align, he replied. She shook her head, amused. Of course you do. A small silence settled again, but it wasn't uncertain. It was reflective. Susan glanced around the apartment one more time, then back at him. I don't want to move in just because it feels like the next step anymore, she said. David's expression sharpened slightly, not in disagreement, but in focus. Good, he said. I want to move in because we've actually decided what that means, she continued. That's better, he added. She stepped closer still, close enough that neither of them had to raise their voices to be heard. And I want to be part of that decision, she said. You are, he replied. She studied him for a moment. Not after the fact, she clarified. Not catching up. Not responding to what you've already figured out. David held her gaze. Alongside you, she finished. That landed differently. Not as a correction. As a position. David exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of something shifting behind his usually steady composure. Then we do it that way, he said. No hesitation. No qualification. Susan's expression softened just slightly. Okay, she said. Another quiet moment passed between them, but this one felt complete. No loose ends. No unfinished thoughts waiting to surface later. Just understanding. She reached out then, almost absent-mindedly, and adjusted the sleeve of his shirt. You know, she said, this is not how I pictured us getting to this conversation. How did you picture it? He asked. Less analytical, she said. That seems unlikely, he replied. She laughed softly. Yeah, I'm starting to accept that. David allowed a small smile of his own. Adaptability is useful, he said. I'm learning, she replied again. He nodded once. I noticed. She stepped back slightly, giving herself space to look at him fully. So what's the next step? She asked. This time, when David answered, there was no pause at all. We pick a timeline, he said. Not rushed. Not indefinite. Intentional. She considered that. That sounds reasonable. It usually is, he replied. She rolled her eyes slightly, though the smile remained. Do you ever get tired of being right? I focus on being accurate, he said. She shook her head, laughing quietly. Same thing. Not always, he replied. She looked at him for a second, then nodded. Fair. The evening settled around them, quiet and steady. No urgency pressed against the moment. No expectation hung over it. They hadn't solved everything. There was nothing to solve anymore. They had aligned. Not perfectly, but deliberately. Susan picked up her bag from the chair but didn't move toward the door immediately. Dinner? She asked. David glanced toward the kitchen, then back at her. We can, he said. She tilted her head slightly. At your place this time, she added. He nodded. That works. She set her bag back down. No rush to leave. No need to. Because for the first time since the idea had been introduced, moving forward didn't feel like momentum carrying them. Felt like direction. Chosen. And for both of them, that made all the difference.